All right, guys. We're gonna go ahead and get moving. I want to try to knock out as much of this as I can within the 20 minute mark. I just want to let y'all know that you will be having a quiz on Monday. No need to freak out, just because it's going to be on Socrative, number one, and then number two. You guys, I know that you guys will probably try to use your PowerPoint, so I'm just going to make it an open note quiz, and you guys can just use your lectures and take it, and you'll have all day to do so. So, quiz will be on Monday. All right. So if we move out of Midway, we move into the Battle of Stalingrad. A few things you want to know. Number one, is considered the bloodiest battle of the war, with about 1.8 million casualties. Some say around 2 million, with about half of that coming from the Soviet army alone. And just to kind of touch base off of kind of where things have been. If you remember, Russia and Germany had kind of signed this non-aggression pact so that Hitler could attack Poland. And this really kind of stunned a lot of people, because both sides had communism and fascism were super enemies of each other. Like, there was no friendship there. In fact, even Stalin knew even during his signing of this non-aggression pact, he knew that eventually Hitler was going to try to attack him. Even Stalin had read Mein Kampf and seen the quote where Hitler had said, "When we speak of new territory, we must think of Russia. Destiny itself points the way there." So he knew. The other thing, the big thing, is that no one else knew. And no one really expected Hitler to open up a second front of the war. He had kind of made gains in all these areas, and all of his troops are just kind of sitting there just trying to maintain everything. So no one's expecting him to just divert everything over and try to start a war with Russia. But he does. On June 22nd, 1941, he launches Operation Barbarossa. So once again, using these blitzkrieg tactics, the same ones that he had used against France that just wiped them out in 35 days, he starts doing it to Russia, and he's hoping to defeat them quickly. He wants to get these guys out of the war fast, and by December 1941, so within just a 5-month span, he's essentially done that. He's taken several major key cities to Russia. The Russians have lost over 3 million men. So the Germans are on a roll, but they finally start halting at Moscow. And one of the big reasons is that the oil is low. So they need oil, they need gas to fuel the tanks, to supply the trucks, and they're not getting it as quickly as they need it. That's probably one of the bad things about a blitzkrieg, is that it moves so fast. If you're not careful, you'll outrun your supply chains. So Hitler decides to set his sight on the rich oil region of the Caucasus. Now, if you look at this map, it kind of shows you. If you look down at the bottom part where you see Georgia, where it says AZERB and ARM, that's Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia. And this is where the oil is. In fact, Azerbaijan is massive with oil. So Hitler starts setting his sights for that. But as he's kind of going through the map and making sure everything's where he wants to go, and all the targets are where they all this information, he notices the city of Stalingrad. Now, there's a few reasons why Hitler wants this Stalingrad. Number one, it's important to him because it's an industrial center. This is where all the tanks of the Russian forces are being made. Number two, it would control the Volga River. Now, a lot of people will argue you could control the Volga River at different points. You don't have to go after Stalingrad, which brings us to the third and probably most important reason or biggest reason why Hitler really wanted to go after Stalingrad, and that's because it's named after the leader of the Soviet Union. So what a better way to embarrass the Soviet Union by taking the city that's named after its leader. Stalin, on the other hand, finds that it's important, much for the same two reasons. Its strategic position on the Volga, its important production to the war effort, but this is also where Stalin had fought and won during the Soviet Revolution. This is where he kind of got his start. So this is special to Stalin. Well, one mistake is made right off the bat. Hitler, instead of concentrating his force on Stalingrad, splits it. And most generals will tell you splitting your force is never a good thing. and he does. He sends an army down to the Caucasus regions to get the oil, while he sends another force led by General Paulus to take over Stalingrad. On July 28th, 1942, Stalin issues Order 227, urging not one step back. He realized the situation that they were in, and had the Nazis been able to take Stalingrad, Moscow, and Leningrad the way that they did, had they been able to take Stalingrad, there really wouldn't have been any other defensive position for the Soviet Union except the mountains, which were miles away. But there really isn't any livable terrain outside of that. So this was, if you look at Russia even today, most of the people live around the Volga River and forward, because there's just nothing left. It's a massive country, but very few people live outside the mountain range that kind of separates the Siberian wilderness and the cities to the west. So Russian troops become inspired. Stalin tries to inspire his troops, trying to dig into their nationalism, telling them, hey, this is your motherland that you're fighting for. This is what it all comes down to. But he didn't really need a lot of help, because the Germans were known to be so brutal and barbaric as occupiers that the Russian citizens had seen where the Germans had just slaughtered thousands, and we're like, yeah, we can't let these guys keep coming. And so even the civilians get involved in this, and the civilians, kids, men, women, doesn't matter. They all start digging anti-tank trenches. They're digging all these kind of defenses for the troops. Others are burning their property ahead of the German advance, so that the Germans can't take advantage of resources and supplies that are left by the Soviet people. And on August 23rd, 1942, the attack begins. General Paulus is big on using the long reach of German weaponry. He doesn't really want to get his troops involved. And he starts this with 600 aircraft that bombed the city of Stalingrad. Now, the Soviet Air Force is really too poorly equipped to deal with this, and the city is essentially annihilated. It looks like a post-apocalyptic area. 40,000 Soviets are killed, and civilians who wanted to leave weren't allowed to. Stalin told them, no, you're not going to leave because we're not having anybody take a step back. We're going to stand in this. So, kind of barbaric there from Stalin, but, things happen. So, by the end of August, German tanks have hit the suburbs in the northern part of the city. So if you look at this map, right where you can kind of see, you see the dark coloration against the green, right up into the top area, that's where the German tanks are taking. They're taking this suburb area. And it looks like things are going to go well. The German advance is starting to move, but then all of a sudden it stopped. It can't move as fast. And this is not due to the anti-tank trenches. This isn't due to the level of resistance. It's due to their own pilots. The bombers had bombed Stalingrad so aggressively that rubble was all over the streets. And so it was impossible for tanks to move through these streets. So they had to switch to a more mobile type of artillery. And again, we're back on track. And it wasn't long before Hitler's forces had taken the railway station in the south, and the Mamayev-Kurgan area, which was in the south-central part of the city. And the interesting thing about that was that it was the high terrain of the city. So artillery spotters could go up to the high levels of this of the Kurgan area and spot where they thought artillery should be placed. So this was pretty detrimental. They just from this position, the Germans were able to just waylay any kind of artillery bombardment on the Russians. By mid-September, it looks like the Russians are just about annihilated. The Germans have almost completely taken the city. Stalin sends his best general, Choikov, to command, and these are some things that he knows just from his experience fighting the Germans in the front lines earlier in the war. Number one, he knows that the Germans like to fight at a distance and in the open. They want to be able to use their tanks, their air power, their artillery. And if they're stuck in city combat, it's harder to do that. And he also knows that in order to use the mobility and speed that the Germans like to use, they have to have space. So Choikov reorganizes his army, breaks them into small bands, almost like little stormtrooper groups, and he basically tells them, quote, "I want you to be no further than a grenade's throw away." So these guys are just a few feet apart, a few yards apart, and they're fighting each other. But the strategy behind it was that if they were so close to the German forces, then Paulus couldn't use his planes and artillery for fear of hitting his own troops. So they get really close and they start slowing down the German advance. Another one of the game-changing weapons during the battle was the use of snipers. Now, something that's interesting in the Soviet army that is really not seen in the German army is that the Soviets use women. There are women snipers, there are women pilots, and many of them kind of go down in history as either one of the deadly. I think there's one lady who became one of the deadliest Russian snipers in history, and another girl who was a pilot who became one of the best aces in Russian history. Women are kind of at the forefront. You know, being a sniper, you need patience and precision, and women were thought to be pretty good at that. So they used them. The Germans were kind of appalled. They couldn't believe that they were fighting women on the front line. This to them just showed the barbaric nature of the Soviet forces. Women in Germany were meant to have babies. You know, you were supposed to be the tool that kept the Aryan bloodline going. Soviets, they were like, all they are fighting. And so the Germans soon realized that it wasn't the military they were having to defeat. They were going to have to annihilate the Russian people, because every Russian citizen, if they could, would have picked up a rifle and fought. And despite this, despite the new tactic, despite the snipers, Germans are still able to make gains. And in fact, they really kill Soviets in droves, because once they set up these machine gun positions, once they take an area, the Soviets would launch a counterattack. Well, the Germans would just gun them down, rat-a-tat-a-tat-a-tat-a, and they would go down by the thousands. And then the Russians would just launch another one over and over again, and the Germans would just mow it down over and over again. And by October, it becomes clear that really only a miracle is going to save this city. The Germans have 90% of it. Well, that miracle comes in the form of the Russian winter, and something that not many were aware of was an impending Russian counterattack. See, the Russian military was sending in just enough reinforcements to just keep the Germans busy, keep them occupied, keep their attention over here at the city. And so the Russian winter sets in, temperatures are going into -30. The Germans are really ill-equipped for this, and this brings up a couple more mistakes. So number 2, the Germans are short of supplies due to their length of their supply lines. They can't get all the equipment to the front line because these guys have moved so fast, and Russia is a massive country, and they move so fast over a large distance that it's harder for them to get these materials to the troops. So men are sitting there in their summer fighting gear, and it's -30. So they're freezing to death, quite literally. The third mistake is that German intelligence never realized that the Soviets were capable of an operation, of a counterattack operation. And the Sixth Army intelligence had even made the high command aware, hey, we've got some suspicious troop movements that are happening outside the city and along the flanks. And the German command was like, no, that's stupid. There's no way. And I guess essentially you could make it a mistake number 4 was that the Germans never really thought the Slavs were capable of doing anything. They thought the Slavic people were just kind of a brutish people. They would fight hard for their country, but in all, they were really not very intelligent and really had no I guess you would say aptitude, no real awareness of their own safety. They would just run into battle by the droves and get killed. That was how people kind of viewed the Soviets. Well, on November 19th, the war takes a turn. These Russian troops outside the city that had been ignored had been moving through the night so that the Germans never saw them. And finally on November 19th, they smash out this counterattack from two different points with over 1 million men, and the German. The I guess you could say the fifth mistake, or depending on what you want to order it as. The big problem with the Germans was that their best troops were in the front, and so their support areas were very, very weak. And so some of you guys see that in sports. You'll see where teams aren't very confident in their defense, and so they spend all their time on offense. That's their weapon. So they either try to outscore you, or they try to put so much offensive pressure on you that you can't get to their defense because their defense is too weak. That's exactly the way the German force was. All their best soldiers, all their best troops were right there in the city. And the only military troops that were left were Romanian, Hungarian, and Italian troops that had already argued and said, look, we're not as well armed as you guys are. We need support. And the Germans were like, no, shut up, you're stupid. And so this kind of bites them in the butt because the Russians had found out that the best of the German army was right there at the front. So let's just go around them. And they do. And they smash into these Romanian and Hungarian and Italian lines and completely encircle the German force. And just like that, over 300,000 Germans are completely surrounded in a move that was exactly like the German pincer movements that they did against every other force. It's the exact same thing. The Russians basically took a play out of the German playbook and used it against them, and they never even saw it coming. So this kind of brings us to the end of the battle. See, the Germans, and this is actually a picture of a German soldier here that's frozen solid. A lot of these German soldiers are starting to freeze to death because they don't have the gear. So General Paulus has two decisions he can make. Do I fight my way out, or do I wait on a supporting force to fight their way in? And so Paulus appeals to Hitler, which he's going to do several times, and Hitler's like, no, you're going to stay. See, Hitler kind of thought the Slavic people were inferior. So no, you're not gonna surrender in the face of inferior people. You will either you will fight, and if you can't win, you will die. That's kind of the way Hitler thought of it. You're not going to surrender. That's a disgrace. So Hitler is then fueled more, and his delusion is fueled more by Hermann Göring, this idiot Luftwaffe leader. I mean, yeah, he was a great ace during World War I, but if you remember, his arrogance or his refusal to accept, I guess you could say, the humanity of the Luftwaffe and that the fact that they could be stopped, slowed down, and ineffective during the Battle of Britain. Well, the same guy is now telling Hitler, hey, we are capable of supplying those troops. We'll get them the clothes they need. We'll get them the food they need. And we'll get them the ammunition they need. Hitler's like, hey, man, great idea. You go through with it. Well, the thing is the German troops that are trapped, which is over 300,000, again, they need about 800 tons of food and supplies every day. That is a ton. And logistically, there's very few people on Earth that can make that work at that time. Maybe more so now, but at that time, almost none. And so the German Luftwaffe takes off. They're having to fight air to air with the Russian Air Force, and to get in to drop the supplies. But the thing is that the Germans are only dropping 10 to 15 tons of supplies, way short of the 800 tons that are needed. So they're not even getting what's needed to the troops. So General Manstein, he's a German officer that's in the south. He tries to fight his way from the south into Stalingrad, and he's stopped about 48 kilometers away. It's just he cannot do more than what he can do. Again, all the best troops are surrounded in the city. What he has is kind of like the second and third string, and they can't. They advance a little bit, but they can't break through to the German army. And so his attack fails. So as a last effort, Hitler is going to promote General Paulus to field marshal. Now this is kind of interesting in several ways. Number one, a field marshal had never surrendered ever. Basically, you were either gonna fight to the death, or you could just take your own life. But a field marshal never surrendered. And when they asked Paulus, they said, Paulus, look, man, this is a no-win situation. At this point in the war, you've lost your chance of fighting out of the Russian blockade. Just kill yourself. And he said, I'm not going to kill myself. I'm a Christian. And literally the next day, after being appointed field marshal, Paulus surrenders to the Russian forces. Now, at this point, over 2/3 of the German army was lost. Over the 300,000 men that were there, 2/3 of them are done. 91,000 men are going to surrender. But out of those 91,000, only 5,000 ever make it back to Germany after the war due to the conditions they faced in the camps, the prison camps. This battle, again, is considered one of the costliest of the entire war. The Russians lost over 1 million men. Germans would lose about 800,000. But the thing is that German media, the German propaganda, basically said no. The soldiers all fought to the death, and then the high command would go on to blame the weather, and then they would blame the weakness of their own allies. And this was all done to kind of not admit that the Russians had beaten them. The Russians, they just could not comprehend the fact that the Russians might have outsmarted them, because the Russians, after all, are supposed to be inferior people. So that would not have looked good to the Germans, to the German public. So they kind of spun it a different way. However, this is the first time anywhere in the world and during the war that the Germans were ever slowed down or defeated. And so this kind of lets the rest of the world know, hey, look, man, this juggernaut that was Germany, they can be stopped. We can beat these guys. And from there on out, Germany would be doing nothing but retreating for the rest of the war on the Eastern Front. So with that, guys, remember, you got a quiz. You got a quiz on Monday, and you can use your all these lectures and information to help you out. So best of luck. Hope you guys have a good weekend.